While China is dealing with its own economic challenges, it also has to grapple with one of the most important bilateral relations in the world, that between China and the United States. At the ongoing meeting of the special session of China Development Forum, there are many coming from both sides that are opinion leaders and key decision makers in the process.
This Sunday saw the opening of the autumn summit of the China Development Forum. The two-day summit is being held in Beijing, with China's opening and reform as its theme. At the opening session of the forum, former World Bank President Robert Zoellick recounted his first trip to China in 1980. He said he witnessed the country's remarkable achievements in the past 4 decades himself. Yet, undeniably, the turbulent economic situation in the world has posed enormous challenges for China's future. In his speech, Mr. Zoellick commented that devotion to economic openness is the right way to tackle the challenges.
China has benefited from its openness, and that's true today and will be true in the future. More open investment would offer win-win opportunities, better services, stronger international connections.
Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are at the center of discussion. At the forum, experts concluded that the rise of protectionism and unilateralism in recent years is a major setback for the globalization trend. Former World Bank chief economist Justin Lin Yifu noted that the economies of China and the U.S. are complementary rather than competitive.
The industrial sectors, production in China, are mostly in the low, medium value-added sectors, and the U.S. are in the high value-added sectors. Trade means China will be able to provide low-cost goods to consumers in the U.S. and low-cost intermediate goods to producers in the U.S.
Many experts believe that the ongoing trade war is not only going to hurt China and the U.S., but also all countries involved in the global supply chain.
I've been talking to Stephen Orlins, the president of Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Let's listen in our interview. Steve, welcome to CGTN.
Wonderful to be back with you.
I know you've been traveling so much recently as a result of the latest development in U.S.-China relations. Help me to understand, what does it mean at the end of the month, the negotiation between the two sides?
Well, it's good that they're negotiating. It's good that there still is a process by which the United States and China can solve its trade and investment problems. So I think that's positive. I think it's important to recognize that President Trump, this is not something new for President Trump, that for 30 years he's believed that it's an unlevel playing field that has allowed China to get this enormous trade surplus that it has with the United States. So that tells you that it's not going to be easy at the end of the month for the United States and China to reach any kind of agreement where the tariffs that President Trump is talking about do not enter into effect. I think there is some chance that we could, because of the midterm elections in the United States in early November, it is possible that we could see some kind of deal where U.S. exports to China increase tremendously. So we see more agricultural products, we see more machinery, we see more airplanes that are exported to China from the United States. And we have the tariffs not go into effect. I think that's very unlikely, but it's possible because the midterm elections are now tending towards the Democrats. President Trump is obviously a Republican, controlling both the House and the Senate. The House, which has 435 members all up for re-election, the polling is looking like that is going to shift to the Democrats.
But on the other hand, Steve, many argue as a result of this, President Trump, before the midterm election, is going to go all his way, as long as he believes there's anything that he can do in order to win back, even just for a few votes.
I think the political analysis, if he decides that he wants to make a deal, it would be because the tariffs are negatively impacting states where there are swing seats, where the seat may go Democratic or it may go Republican, especially in agricultural areas. The tariffs are negatively affecting U.S. farmers. If they say, well, we're not going to go out and vote for the Republican, we're just going to vote for the Democrat, or we're not going to vote at all, that might swing the House to the Democratic side. So if President Trump feels that the tariffs are negatively affecting those districts, and it's going to get, by ending the tariffs, it's going to get people to vote for the Republican candidates, it's possible he would make that compromise.
But what are the possibilities, if you could think about it? I know you've been talking to people, insiders related to the negotiations. What could be the topics that the two sides then can really discuss that would make both sides accept eventually? This is very much like almost one of the last negotiations that could happen before the midterm election.
Yes, well, there's short-term issues, so they're tariff issues, they're export issues, they're ones which Chinese government can simply increase exports, which is a short-term solution. We'd see an increase in exports of soybeans, wheat, corn, airplanes, machinery, just have China buying more. So President Trump could announce, well, the tariffs worked, we now have a more balanced trade, something in the neighborhood of 100 billion, even though he's called for 200 billion. So that is one possible outcome.
The reason why there has not been breakthrough is because there have been, some say, unrealistic expectations coming from the U.S. side for the Chinese to react. And many wonder whether the U.S. side is also going to see there's any consensus they are having in terms of reaching an agreement with China. Mutual respect, many say, Steve, is a very important thing. In these kinds of negotiations, there has to be mutual respect. You can't push one person and one country to a corner in order to reach an agreement. It just doesn't work for China.
There is some analysis that we have a split within the administration, that President Trump, Advisor Navarro, and Ambassador Lighthizer really want to take a hard line. They don't want to compromise anything. And Secretary Ross and Secretary Mnuchin and National Economic Advisor Kudlow are much more willing to kind of compromise on some of these issues, give a longer runway to allow things to be implemented. And that, to some degree, the invitation is a reflection of the Mnuchin-Kudlow view. And President Trump's announcement last night that, not his announcement, his subordinates saying to U.S. media that tariffs are going to be implemented on 200 billion, an additional 200 billion of Chinese goods, is a reflection of the Navarro-Lighthizer view. So we're seeing both of the views playing out, and ultimately the decision is going to be President Trump's. That in this administration, President Trump is the decider-in-chief on China policy.
Right.
That the processes that existed in previous administrations, where maybe we had a Secretary of State, a National Security Advisor, a Secretary of the Treasury, is now kind of ended, and it all goes to President Trump to make the decision.
People have been reading the book coming from Bob Woodward, talking about the decision-making process when it comes to the tariffs that the president is so keen to work on vis-a-vis many of the major trading partners of the United States. At the very beginning of this debate, a lot of opposition voices coming from within the White House. Of course, the president is keen to go ahead. What does those stories told by Mr. Bob Woodward tell us about the reasoning of the current policy making? And as a result of that, the other sides of Washington's, what their reaction should be about President Trump's current approach?
Well, President Trump, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Lighthizer fundamentally believe that an unlevel playing field has led to this enormous bilateral trade deficit that the United States has with China. Whatever the facts are, I believe that view is not correct, but whatever the facts are, that's what they believe, and these policies emanate from those beliefs. That the only way that you kind of have to, in their view, you have to shake it up. So for decades we've negotiated, the American government has negotiated with China for market opening, for investment opening, for reduction of tariffs. The only way we can get anywhere is by shaking it up and imposing these tariffs.
I wonder how people like you could go to sleep at night. I mean, after all, this is the fruit, the U.S.-China relations, of many people over decades to be where it is today. What can you do about the reality? What others who have been working so hard on this bilateral relationship, on this reality?
That you continue to advocate for a constructive relationship, that you continue to advocate for changes both in Chinese policy towards the United States and in U.S. policy
Is your voice
towards
being
China.
heard? Is your voice being heard in today's Washington?
Is it being heard? I mean, yes, it's being heard. When this administration remains open to hearing dissenting voices. So when I go down to Washington and visit the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the doors remain open to me.
But you said everything about this administration is done
and
by the president, in a way.
The president, but you know, you have to keep advocating for what you believe is the right policy. You keep advocating for what you believe in. I also come to China and I meet with the Chinese leadership and I advocate for changes in Chinese policy towards the United States. I advocate for changes in Chinese global policy. I advocate for more transparency. I advocate for more economic reform. I advocate for more opening. I advocate for more U.S. businesses here. I advocate for monopolies to be broken, because the winners of these policies in China are the Chinese people, without regard to U.S.-China relations. The winners for reform and opening are the Chinese policy. Yes, U.S. companies win too, but that's peripheral. What's core is when reform and opening occurs, as it has over the last 39 years, now 40 years, we see the Chinese people win, and that needs to continue regardless of what happens in U.S.-China relations.
Are we going to see a much worse period of time before things get better?
The atmosphere in the United States is very negative. And I think it's important that people in China understand that it's not only President Trump who has a negative view, and President Trump has had this negative view for 3 decades of China and its dealing in international trade. But the U.S. Congress has a negative view. They have a negative view of a lot of different aspects of Chinese policy. The American media has a negative view. The reporting on China is consistently negative. American think tanks and academia are turning much more negative towards China.
Has it become a self-feeding process in Washington, with all of the factors you just mentioned earlier, that they are feeding each other on the negative feelings about China, and also not necessarily working at all about the solutions?
I think people are looking for solutions. Certainly, we at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations every single day try and figure out ways to make the relationship more constructive, more productive for the people on both sides of the Pacific. And that work continues, us and many other organizations. And there still are enormous numbers of people who believe that together the United States and China have a chance to confront the world problems. But separately, we're both doomed to failure. And in the end, it's going to be the people of the United States and the people of China who decide to tell their governments what should the U.S.-China relationship be. And in my view, the people of the United States do not want a confrontational relationship with China. They don't want to spend money on ships and missiles rather than on infrastructure and education and social programs. And the people in China, the same. They don't want to spend their money on confrontation with the United States. They want to spend their money educating their children, making for a better life for the next generation.
The welfare of the people.
And ultimately, that is what's going to drive the relationship. So even if we have short and midterm disruption, in the end, the peoples of the United States are going to, and China, are going to pull each other together. And think about the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States and the tens of thousands of American students here. And that's the next generation. And their greater understanding of each other's societies, they're going to be the policymakers of the future. And the greater understanding is going to lead to closer U.S.-China relations.
We hope that will be the case, even though there have been reporting about President Trump suggesting putting labels on Chinese students in studying in America. But having said that, though, as you may know, China-U.S. relations is not just bilateral. It is also an important relationship on the international stage. We see now, Steve, as you can notice, that the U.S. is trying to withdraw from many of the international institutions, suggesting it is not tipping toward the U.S. side. Many wonder if the United States is really moving forward or moving backward.
President Trump will be president for 4 years, 8 years, we don't know which. And then a new president will come in who will probably have a different view of America's role in the world. You know, U.S. is kind of, it's much more like a pendulum. It swings one way and then it swings the other.
But the world cannot wait, just the United States all the time.
I don't think the world is waiting.
On the other hand, you see the impact of U.S.-China relations is making ripple effects about bilateral relations, multilateral relations around the world. You've seen China's interaction with developing countries very actively and frequently recently, China, African countries, for example. And you also see China, Russia, together have been working on bilateral issues and multilateral issues. The two presidents already meeting at least 3 times this year bilaterally. So many wonder whether the United States is really leaving the stage to the other players to interact with one another, and eventually what does that mean for United States itself?
Well, clearly the United States has changed. What happened? You have to go back to the election in 2016, that states which had manufacturing bases which were eroded or the people thought were eroded as a result of globalization decided, you know, in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, decided to vote for Mr. Trump rather than Secretary Clinton. And that presaged America's view, a change in America's view of globalization and its benefits. And that a lot of the policies that you see stem from that election in 2016. So again, we'll have another election in a couple of months, and then we'll have an election in 2020. And I believe we'll see the pendulum swing back. Now, of course, that's not the sole issue in an American.
Will America pushing, as a result, some of the unlike partners together?
I think, you know, like China-Russia relations, China-India relations, U.S.-India relations are determined by national interests and historical legacies. I'm often asked, do I fear a Russian-China cooperative effort against the United States? And my answer is no.
In Washington, when you were being asked that question?
I'm asked all over. I'm asked in the United States. I'm asked in Chinese media. And my answer is no, because I'm a student of Chinese history. I know the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I know it from the very beginning. I think they're historical legacies that are extremely problematic for any future cooperation. And what I do know about Chinese leadership is they know history. They know history really well, and they don't forget history.
Before we go, Steve, with decades of working on U.S.-China relations and your very intense interactions with both sides, is there something that, a few key words as your advice to both sides leading up to the negotiation later this month and certainly longer prospect of bilateral relations?
I think the longer prospects of bilateral relations remain positive. I think in the end, the problems that the people of the United States and the people of China confront have more in common than they are different. That ultimately, you know, I always think about when I sit in my apartment in New York and I look out, it always reminds me of the problems that we confront. You know, I see Wall Street from my apartment. I can see the towers of Wall Street. And I remember the economic crisis of exactly 10 years ago this week. And that is a great fear of all Americans, and it's a great fear of all Chinese. And only if we work together are we going to be able to solve that. And then I see the Hudson River from my apartment, and I remember, you know, we had a superstorm that basically wiped out lower Manhattan. It flooded everywhere. The subways closed. The city became non-functional. And it's a result of climate change. And ultimately, the states of the United States know it. The leadership in China knows it. And at some point, the federal government in the United States is going to recognize that this is the case. And the United States and China are going to have to come together to combat combat climate change, because they're the leading countries. And third and finally, I look out and I see the site of 9/11 from the apartment. I see the new buildings that are going up. And I realize that a great threat, that what Americans, what people in New York think about, is terrorism. We always worry about terrorism because we lived through 9/11. We've just last week gone through another anniversary of 9/11 where they stand at the site of 9/11 and the family members read off the names of every person that's died. Still now, 17 years later, we do that. And all of America watches this. And terrorism remains foremost in Americans' mind. Those three issues are the ones which are going to determine the U.S.-China relationship. Not all the noise that exists today, people looking at this tariff and this restriction and that restriction and this visa.
Okay.
And ultimately, it's going to be driven by what the people think. And the people are going to demand, both in the United States and in China, that the governments be cooperative, not conflicting.
We hope that will be the case. Steve, what a pleasure.
It will be the case. It will be the case, Jiang Wei.